Welcome again to the Legacy Project and our remembrance of the women's suffrage movement and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I have some opening remarks. My name is Professor John Saltez. I teach journalism at CCM and I co-chair the Legacy Project. We are very excited to have Susan Ware as our distinguished speaker tonight. A pioneer in the field of women's history and a leading feminist biographer, Susan is the author and editor of numerous books on 20th century US history. Educated at Wellesley College and Harvard University, she is taught at NYU and Harvard, where she served as editor of the biographical dictionary Notable American Women, Completing the 20th Century. Since 2012, she has served as the general editor of the American National Biography. Susan has long been associated with the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, where she serves as the honorary women's suffrage centennial historian. She has numerous books to her name, including Beyond Suffrage, Women in the New Deal, Holding Their Own, American Women in the 1930s, Still Missing, Amelia Earhart and the Search for Modern Feminism, and Game, Set, Match, Billie Jean King and the Revolution in Women's Sports. Tonight, our conversation will focus on Susan's latest work, Why They March, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote. This powerful book, which is an excellent educational and inspirational read, goes behind the headlines of the women's suffrage movement, paying respect to the names many of us know, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but also digging deeper into individuals and narratives that, while existing in the archives, have not received the same scholarship and attention. Within these pages are stories of African-American suffragists who fought for women's rights, but also faced racism from white women involved in the movement. There is the unique tale of Mormon women fighting for recognition while also facing public criticism for polygamy. There's Claiborne Cailin, who in the spirit of Inez Milholland ventured out on a pilgrimage on horseback to spread her message of women's rights. Other sections of the book focus on mountaineering suffragists, the international women's movement, and theatrical allegories that were sweeping and epic narratives that promoted the role of women in society and throughout history. Throughout Why They March, Susan uses objects to help tell these stories. There's the prison pin of the National Woman's Party, which was worn by women who were arrested for the cause, and a photograph of Sojourner Truth that was sold as a keepsake and helped to fund Sojourner's campaign. Ultimately, Susan is after a more inclusive look at the women's suffrage movement, in my opinion, and the ultimate takeaway is the collected and courageous individuals who strove for decades, for a lifetime, to not only pass and ratify the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, but to turn American society toward a place of greater equality and equitable opportunity. This narrative is not divorced from the students and community members on this Zoom call tonight. In many ways, you stand as great beneficiaries of the sacrifice and strategies that played out 100 years ago and beyond. New Jersey in particular had a role to play in this narrative, as my good friend and colleague, Dr. Rita Heller, mentioned to me a few days ago. Just an hour's drive from our campus is a home where Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived for nearly 20 years of her life. In that house in 1876, she helped to write the history of women's suffrage. She also tried in 1880 to vote at a local hotel with Susan B. Anthony, only to be turned away. An experience that is very similar to one found in Why They Marched. Tonight, as we try to do at every Legacy Project, please try to see the connections between your life, your own story, and the narratives of those who came before. Contextualize how these untold stories, tales of triumph and struggle, discrimination and sisterhood, pilgrimage and pathos, have impacted society in 2021. Don't let this 100th anniversary pass by without some reflection and lessons learned. As Susan writes in her epilogue, history matters, and heed the words of Susan B. Anthony, which were left as an inscription in a 1902 edition of History of Women's Suffrage. This is a remarkable find that Susan puts in her book. Susan B. Anthony wrote, "This closes the records of the 19th century of work done by and for women. What the 20th century will show, no one can foresee, but that it will be vastly more and better, we cannot fail to believe. By you and I have done the best we knew, and so must rest content, leaving all to younger hands. Thank you, Susan, for sharing those words in your book, and thank you for joining us tonight.
That was one of the best introductions I've ever been given, so thank you back. And of course, that final inscription from Susan B. Anthony is so much what the Legacy Project is trying to encourage, thinking about generations and leaving it to younger hands, and the struggles being ongoing, but always with historical roots. So very glad to be here tonight.
We're going to do a Q&A for a bit, maybe about 30 minutes, and then we'd love to hear from you. And then we'll finish by 8 o'clock tonight. Maybe just to begin, could you tell me what inspired you to write this particular book? Had you been researching some of these quote unquote untold stories for a while?
Well, I think what I realized was that the women's suffrage, the history of women's suffrage, had really been part of my entire professional career as a historian and as a feminist. I marched in my very first feminist demonstration on August 26, 1970, which was the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And suffrage was always very much part of my teaching along the way, and my long association with the Schlesinger Library, which is the premier women's history repository, especially for suffrage material, has meant that it has just always been on my mind. And I think that I saw the centennial coming, and I thought, this is going to be really interesting to have the 100th anniversary of suffrage in a presidential election year. And I want to be part of that conversation. And for me, the best way to be part of a conversation is to write a book, which is what I did. And I think that I really feel in many ways like I've come full circle to where I started. And it's been a very satisfying journey for me. And it has been especially satisfying being able to share some of these stories, some of which I knew already, and some of which were new to me, with new audiences of people. And I really think that that's one of the benefits of the centennial celebrations that went on despite the pandemic. It was really a chance to engage people both with a fascinating piece of women's history, but also a piece of political history and the history of social movements that is very relevant to where we are today and where we might be going next.
I love that each chapter begins with an object that kind of opens up the narrative for the reader. Where are these objects? They seem to be kind of in the archives up there at the institute that you've been working at, the library that you've been working on. Is that correct?
It is. Back when we could actually go into libraries and do research. And, you know, I know there's some history majors that are on this Zoom call. And I will just say that one of the great joys of being a historian is when you are in an archive and you have called for a box of something and you open it up and there is a suffrage pin or a sash or a plaque that was on a tree or a poster. And it's just such a way of making the history come alive, because you can imagine the person who either created this artifact or who wore the button on a suffrage march. And for me, it has always made the history come alive. And I thought, okay, why don't I see if I can do that as well in my book? And so it meant that I had to choose 19 objects as well as 19 subjects, 19 for the 19th Amendment, obviously. And that was a hard task. I had so many more I could have chosen, but I think that in the end, I'm really glad that I found a way to combine both an attention to material culture as well as biography. And I will just say, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, and if we want, I was so inspired by the opening object, which is a suffrage tree plaque that up here on my farm in New Hampshire, where I have been for the last year, I created my own suffrage forest. And I had plaques made of each of the women in my book. And then I mounted them on trees on a trail. And when I walk down there with my dogs and you see these plaques and you just can imagine that the women are talking to each other and the trees are talking to each other. And for me, it's such a powerful image of a social movement because it's made up of all these individuals who, when you put them together, it turns into something much bigger. So obviously, I was a convert to material culture. And if any of you are ever up in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, you're welcome to come visit my suffrage forest.
Well, one of the early chapters in the book goes into detail about Sojourner Truth, which is a name I think a lot of us might know, but you kind of take a different perspective. Why kind of focus on her story and also kind of put it towards the beginning of the book?
Well, one of the challenges I had in the book was to cover a social movement that went on for almost 100 years. And so I wanted to be able to do justice to the early parts of the movement, as well as the parts at the end when it finally moves towards victory in 1920. And Sojourner Truth was such a good person to open out, especially the key importance of the abolition movement to the women, to the development of women's rights in this country. And it is such a productive synergy that happens in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s between abolition and women's rights. And there you have Sojourner Truth. It also was very important to me from the beginning to foreground the question of the racism of a movement which was predominantly run by white women who were not always welcoming of the contributions of African-American women suffragists or other women of color. And so Sojourner Truth allowed me to get all those issues out there. Plus, she had this amazing object I could use, which was what's called a carte de visite, which is like a little postcard with a photograph that could be cheaply reproduced and then handed out. And she sold it in order to finance her lecturing. So that for me, that just seemed like a way of telling a lot of the larger history that I wanted, but also telling it through the life of a former slave who spans both the early years of the suffrage movement and its complicated story after the Civil War.
One thing that was very revealing for me reading the book and that I learned from it was that states, before there was a federal amendment, states really had different interpretations and allowed some women to vote and others not to. For example, I believe the chapter about Utah had this in particular. Could you help our students understand some of that, how that some states did allow women to vote before the 19th Amendment and others chose not to?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned, and I guess this shows I'm not a political scientist, is that even today, voting rights are predominantly the province of states. Most voting laws are state laws, and the things like the 19th Amendment or the 14th and 15th Amendments, they are the exceptions, or a law like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In general, it is up to local states and localities to set the terms under which anyone can vote, including women. And so, we think of the 19th Amendment and this moment in 1920 where women finally get the vote. But in fact, an awful lot of women had been voting in various elections for quite a while. Usually the first place they would get access to the vote was in something like school elections, because that was something that women were thought to be especially interested in. So a state or a town could pass school suffrage. or they could allow women to vote in state elections. Um, and then it gets complicated, because if you're in a state where women are enfranchised, then you get to vote for president. So you don't really need to wait for the 19th Amendment. And I think that one of the things that I really learned going through all this was just how important the early victories in the Western states were, because all of a sudden you had a lot more women who were voting, and they were voting at every level, from local to state to national elections. And it gave a momentum, and every single one of the early victories was in the West. And the Northeast very much lagged, and so did the South. But it really gave an example of what could happen when women voted. And also it made politicians pay attention, because if they're taking a stand against suffrage, and then all of a sudden their state decides to enfranchise women, well, those women might use their vote to take retribution on them. So it's all about politics. But again, I think in terms of putting it in the context also of what we all watched in the 2020 election, was so many of the battles about voter suppression were happening on state and local levels. And that's a legacy of how voting is usually handled in our federal system.
I love how the book goes from the macro to the micro, and you have that great section heading of the personal is political in many ways, because that one chapter, if we could focus in on two sisters, where really these very large national issues are going to be found in one family between two sisters. Could you talk a little bit about that story? Because I had not heard about this at all.
Well, just to backtrack a bit, one of the things that I've really tried to do in my scholarship, and also in a women's suffrage anthology I did for the Library of America, is to pay serious attention to the anti-suffrage movement. Because why did it take so long for women to get the vote? Because a lot of people were opposed to it. And I think it really behooves us to think who's opposed. It's not just men. There were women who were opposed to women getting the vote. It's a little hard for us to imagine. And so I wanted to tell that story, but because I'm a storyteller and a biographer, I thought, well, how can I make this come alive? And there were two very well-known sisters from New York, Maud Nathan and Annie Nathan Meyer. And you look at their biographies, and they're both well-educated and well-connected and involved in all kinds of philanthropic and charitable activities. And you would think that both of them would end up as on the suffrage side. And one of the sisters, Annie, becomes an anti-suffragist, and quite a vocal one. So you have the two fighting Nathan sisters. And I think that for me, it was a way of sort of personalizing it, but also making the important point that not all women believe that women should have the vote. And to put that in context, what we need to remember is that in the early 20th century, politics was dirty business. If you think about machine politics in the cities, and polling places were in saloons, and there was copious amounts of liquor consumed. And these were not places where respectable women would have felt comfortable going to cast their vote. And what we're used to now, which is voting in schools and churches, is a direct result from having women in the suffrage movement be successful. But there's also a sense that many women felt that women could have a larger say in politics if they stayed above the political party, stayed outside the political parties. So they would be nonpartisan, rather than getting caught up in what do the Democrats say, what do the Republicans say. And for women who were anti-suffragists, that was often the key determinant to it. And I would just point out that that, in fact, is the stance that the League of Women Voters has adopted, of being nonpartisan. And the League of Women Voters is a direct outgrowth of the suffrage movement. I still can't really imagine a woman organizing against giving women the vote. It just doesn't, it's like, go figure. But I do think we need to have these women as part of the story. And the Nathan sisters gave me, I think, a way of making the larger points I wanted, but also putting it in the context of a family. And not surprisingly, there was some sibling rivalry going on. And I kind of got the sense that Annie really enjoyed being an anti-suffragist, in part to needle her older sister. I mean, there was more to it than that. But again, it's a good story. And it's also, for me as a biographer, it's a way of making the history come alive by telling it through individuals. And so you can think, oh, I remember, there were two sisters on either side, or there's Claiborne Cailin who rides her horse across Massachusetts. And rather than it being just some huge movement that's faceless and passionless and just somehow seems boring, this way, when you bring it down to real people, it's not boring. It's very real. And it's been very satisfying for me to hear from readers, and including you, John, in our communications earlier, who really responded in that way to how the story comes alive.
I'm curious, you mentioned Claiborne Cailin, and she obviously follows in the footsteps of Inez Milholland a bit. This very public way, this very symbolic way to bring the cause around on horseback. Do you think it had a tremendous impact? I know maybe she was going town to town and she had some of the limitations of just her own travel, but it did seem that just by virtue of the symbolic nature of what she was trying to do, that she really got a lot of traction there.
I think she did get a lot of traction, but the way I think of a social movement, and especially in the last decade leading up to 1920, is that it is just all of these dots and individual actions all across the country that each are having their own impact on the people who heard her speak or who saw her ride into town on her horse. And it's the multiplier effect. There are just so many more of them. And it's also something that I really wanted to capture in the last decade of the suffrage movement, was that the suffragists really take their battle to the streets. This is when they go out, and not only are they riding horses and having public meetings, they're having suffrage parades, which are a new thing in major cities. And they dress in white and they have sashes, and it's very powerful to see women claiming public space to make their political point. And they knew exactly what they were doing. And I think it made a huge difference in terms of finally, what you need to do is you need to make suffrage be on everybody's mind. You got to be in their everybody's face. And I think that in the 19th century, when it was a much smaller movement, I think of it as happening sort of in church parlors and school meetings, but people are just talking among themselves. It's not having that broad impact. And in the last decade, it really does take to the streets, and it becomes something that you cannot ignore. That also then inflames the opposition. So the battle continues. But that's something that I felt was really important to draw out. And then, if we're looking for modern parallels, if you think about the women's suffrage parades in Washington, like the one I write about, and the Women's March of 2017, with the sort of the same branding. The suffrage colors were purple, gold, and white. with the Women's March, it was the pink pussy hats. And again, it's an instantly recognizable statement, political statement of, again, of taking to the streets and reclaiming public space in pursuit of a political cause.
I was wondering if you could draw a distinction for us between American suffragists and British suffragists, because in the book you do talk that that there's obviously unity between the two, and there was women who were on both coasts trying their hardest, but there was also a bit of a stigma or stereotype about the British suffragists as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think this sort of gives me a good excuse to give my little spiel about the difference between suffragists and suffragettes. And suffragette was the term that was chosen and used by the British movement. And they deliberately, they embraced it. It's one of those words that kind of diminishes women by making them sound less than full individuals, but they embraced it. They also embraced a much more radical approach to making their political statement that included violence against property, doing things like blowing up post boxes and throwing bricks in through windows and burning down houses occasionally. And this was not something that American suffragists wanted to be linked to. And so they very much would not use the phrase suffragette in order to distinguish themselves, because American suffragists never embraced violence in their cause. They were totally nonviolent. The opponents would use a phrase like suffragette, again, as a diminish women. But I can always tell whether somebody knows their suffrage history now. If they use the term suffragette and they're talking about the American movement, they're using it incorrectly. And I actually had to educate the folks at the New York Times as they were getting ready to do all their suffrage coverage that it was not appropriate to use the term suffragette. So that's my little message. Having said that, clearly the way that the British movement kind of sprang to life in 1908 had a huge impact on the American movement, especially on Alice Paul, a local New Jersey resident who came back and took a much more radical approach, which eventually involved women chaining themselves or picketing the White House, which had never been done before, risking arrest, and then going on hunger strikes when they were in prison and being force-fed. And that, again, is a tactic that she had learned in England. One of the things that I wish I had had more time to talk about is just how suffrage is a worldwide phenomenon, women's suffrage. And if you think about New Zealand and Australia, they enfranchised their women before America. The story in Europe, some places do, some places don't. France doesn't until 1944. But all of the suffragists, it's like they knew each other. They felt like they were part of a network. And I was just amazed at how the women that I was writing about would think nothing about going to a conference in Budapest, which back in 1904 would involve a 5-week or 3-week going by boat and then travel. But this was very important to them. And I think it again speaks to how they felt they were part of something larger. And unfortunately, a lot of times it was the white European suffragists who felt that they knew the way that things should be done, and they kind of looked down on others, like in places like China, that they felt, or Latin America, were not as up to date on women. But there really is an international movement of which the United States case is very much part of that story. And I think that's, again, to put in a plug for, for the history majors, one of the things that American historians are doing, are much more aware of, is how much the American story is part of a larger transnational global context. And that's been true for quite a while. And the suffrage movement is a great way to access those kind of connections.
You mentioned the protests outside of the White House, and there comes a part in the book and within this history that we're talking about where those protests were taking place, arrests were happening, and also war had broken out. And I think there seemed to be a bit of an inner conflict, even a conflict within the movement on whether it was appropriate to protest the White House or not. And they really reasoned to themselves, yes, we still need to fight for these rights, even if the country is fighting abroad. Could you talk about that unique time of how maybe war also disrupted or kind of coincided with this story?
Well, in some ways, war, it disrupted the movement, but it also provided opportunities for women to be involved in war preparations and home front defense and things like that, and show what good citizens they were, and therefore worthy of the vote. And President Woodrow Wilson really handed them the perfect opening, where his campaign slogan in 1916 is basically "make the world safe for democracy." And the suffragists sort of raise their hands and say, Mr. President, we don't have democracy in our country. And if we're working for democracy worldwide, then we also need to provide democracy at home. Having said that, there is a clear split in the movement between those who support the war and those like Alice Paul and her pickets who oppose the war. And I think what I've learned by studying this is that in some ways, at the time, the two wings really felt like that it was awful, what the other side was doing. And yet it's actually kind of helpful, because the more mainstream suffragists, they can be supporting the war effort, they can be supporting the president, they can be doing traditional kind of lobbying and say, we're not like those women who are picketing the White House. And then the pickets at the White House can say, we're not like those women who are just going along with the war. And I think having both groups simultaneously working towards the same goal is actually not such a bad thing. And it has precedents earlier in the suffrage movement, where after the Civil War, the movement was also split into two rival wings. And I don't think that's necessarily such a bad thing.
Many of the issues that you look at in the book continue to this day, the conversations, the dialogue, the debates, and some of the images that you describe as well. Some of these protests right outside the White House, I mean, we have present day examples of that. The whole allegory taking place on the steps of a federal building, showing kind of a protest that could be peaceful and artistic, in stark contrast to what happened on January 6th. Do you kind of see that some of the historical examples through the frame of today is kind of an interesting, sometimes sad way to look at these stories?
I wouldn't use the word sad. I think that, well, to backtrack a little bit, when I first thought about being part of the suffrage centennial and going out on the hustings talking about this, I was afraid that it might be kind of a hard sell. Oh, women's suffrage, who really cares about that? It's not really important. That was not an issue in this election cycle. And in fact, in the last 4 years, there's no question that voting rights and women's roles in politics and in public life are absolutely crucial and critical. And I think that one of the things that I really hope happened for people is that they could see that where we are now is in many ways it's like a continuum of women's political activism that goes back to the 19th Amendment, and it goes back much further than that, and it is ongoing, and it will always be necessary. And I think one of the most sort of touching senses that I got as being part of this was, I'm a historian, I'm used to writing about history, longtime feminist. I really got a sense of being part of something bigger than just me by studying the history and making the connections to where we are today. And I really felt like we are all standing on the shoulders of the suffragists. And one of the things I really regret is that I didn't have a chance to vote in person. I voted by mail in 2020 because I think it would have just been so powerful to walk into my local polling place and think about what the suffragists had gone through to give me that right. I probably would have burst into tears and they wouldn't have known what to do with me. But I really do have the sense of being part of something larger. And it's not just about women's rights, it's about voting rights. It's about why voting matters and those who have been kept from voting and the ongoing struggles providing access to vote. And that is very much where we are now, and it's very much in conversation with the history that I wrote about.
I have one final question, then we'd love to open it up to some of our audience members here. It goes back to kind of what I began with, those opening remarks from Susan B. Anthony. I read what that inscription was, but I thought that story, which is such a powerful story that you end the book with in your epilogue, could you share that with us a little bit about that find, that discovery, and what it means?
Well, I think what you're talking about is it's in a volume of what the suffragist wrote, a 3-volume called The History of Women's Suffrage. And, one of the things I think I like about the movement is that the suffragists were really our first women's historians. They cared about history and they collected their history. They tended to tell it in ways that showed them in the most flattering light. But they also had this sense that it was an ongoing struggle, and that, if you think about someone like Susan B. Anthony, she devotes her entire life to women's rights. She dies in 1906, 14 years before the 19th Amendment is passed, never having voted. And yet that didn't diminish at all her commitment to this larger struggle. And I think that she was really articulating that sense of the being part of it in the present, being aware of the history that leads up to it, but that it will continue and it will always be necessary. And she was right. She was absolutely right.
Our first question comes from Louise. Louise asks, she's curious about why women in New Jersey lost the right to vote. She thinks around 1804. Could you talk a little bit about New Jersey and when they gained the right to vote?
Yeah, well, your state has a proud place in suffrage history because there was a period after the Revolution up until, I think it's 1807, not 1804, where women who owned property were able to vote. And it was because, again, it gets back to the state law and the way the voting qualifications were written. It didn't say male citizen, it just said citizen who owns X amount of property. And again, you had to be a property person usually to vote. And some women fit that criterion. And so they were able to vote. Not huge numbers. Historians really haven't been able to figure out whether it was like a couple dozen or maybe 100 or so, but women definitely voted. And then at a certain point, the legislature sort of looked around and thought, do we want this to be happening? And it wasn't so much that all men were opposed to women voting. It's not just pure misogyny. got involved in the politics of the Democrat or the two political parties at the time, fighting and thinking who's going to be better served by allowing women to vote or by cutting them to vote. So they're pawns in it. But again, it shows that these battles were going on in states and localities, and that some women, perhaps many women, actually did vote before 1920. And I think the other thing that we really need to recognize is that not all women could vote after 1920. And the largest example, of course, are African American women who were still primarily living in the American South, where even though the 19th Amendment granted them the right to vote, they were then subject to the same Jim Crow laws, like literacy tests and poll taxes, that had kept African American men from voting. So for African American women, it was really the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was their 19th Amendment, not the 19th, not the one in moment in 1920.
Luciana has a good question. It's a two-parter. What would you consider the equivalent of the suffrage movement for feminists today? And will there be a fight as impactful as the one for the right of women to vote?
There's so much feminist activity going on now because it's still so necessary. I think probably the closest thing is the Me Too movement, which is able to mobilize broad ranges of men and women, people concerned about dealing with that. One movement that I'm watching is whether the Equal Rights Amendment is going to be revived. And, this is there are a lot of parallels between suffrage and the ERA, including opposition by women to the ERA. And luckily there was no Phyllis Schlafly back in 1920, or maybe we wouldn't have gotten the 19th Amendment. But it will be interesting to see whether a political rallying point like that, amending the Constitution, could draw the same kind of broad coalition that the suffrage movement did. I think not. And I actually don't think the ERA is as necessary as it once might have been because of federal laws and also legislative decisions, especially pioneered by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that have given women many of the equal rights that an ERA would give them. On the other hand, it would be nice to have a statement of equal rights in the Constitution. So we will see. But I don't think that issue resonates with people the way Me Too does, or the way Black Lives Matter has. Those are the issues that are getting people out in the streets and also getting them into the halls of Congress, which can mean many things actually these days, but trying to change things through the system.
Josiah references the opening remarks about Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived in New Jersey and nearby. Not to put you on the spot, but he's wondering, is there anything else kind of in New Jersey that a student or a community member maybe could seek out to see in person that ties into some of this history?
I've mentioned Alice Paul of the National Women's Party. She was the mastermind behind picketing the White House. She grew up in Moorestown, and there is an Alice Paul house or museum of some kind that does quite a lot of programming. I haven't ever been there. I think I probably would have gone if everything hadn't shut down because of the pandemic. But that's the New Jersey connection I think of. And I'd really forgotten about Elizabeth Cady Stanton moving here. I mean, most people associate Cady Stanton with Seneca Falls, New York, which is a fairly small community in upstate New York, where as a young mother with, like five children under the age of 7, she was kind of climbing the walls. And that was one of the reasons behind the original Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which is often cited as the beginning of the women's rights movement in this country. I actually think it started well before then. But if you've ever visited the National Women's Historic Site in Seneca Falls, it is a small town. And I suspect that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was so glad to be able to get out and move to New Jersey and be much closer to where that action was, which was New York and Washington.
Kelly, we appreciate your question. I think Susan kind of answered that with the Me Too movement. We're going to move on to Professor Michelle Altiri, and I think she wants to ask it in person. So hi, Michelle.
Hi. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This talk today has been so wonderful and reinvigorating. So I appreciate your time and your thoughts. I guess kind of going to the point of being reinvigorating, I know I can't be the only one who feels so exhausted at different points in today's day and age with the amount of battles and fights that it feels like we need to fight on so many levels. But especially as a woman in America today, I feel like there's still so many barriers that we have to fight up against in the workplace and in the home and so many different levels. So I was hoping to pick your brain a little bit. Maybe this is a personal question, but how do you keep from being too exhausted, or what do you do when you feel so exhausted with the battles that we fight and have been fighting for so long to try to find the energy to keep going?
Well, maybe there it helps to be a historian because I'm trained to think of the big picture. And so even if I have my moments of discouragement and frustration and exhaustion, as we all do, if you step back and see the kind of arc of progress, it's moving forward. And I think about just the transformational amount of change that has happened in my lifetime in the almost 50 years that I've been involved in as a feminist historian. And I must admit, when I started out, I thought all we had to do was sort of, as feminists, raise the issues. Everyone would say, oh, of course, nobody ever mentioned that before. We will change things. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. And I've realized that it is part of a much larger ongoing struggle. And yet, even though there are moments where we seem to backslide, I think in general, if I think about the difference between my life and the life of my mother or my grandmother, and we can all do this in our families, that there is a forward movement, and the issues are hard issues. I mean, what we're trying to deal with is difficult and it's exhausting. And yet it's so much better when you can work with other people in coalitions, in institutions like universities, in voluntary organizations. And there's always more that needs to be done. There always will be. But I guess maybe I'm one of those glass half full people rather than glass half empty. And that's what keeps me going. And also, I have the best job in the world. I get to get up in the morning and research and write about what women have done in history and the history of feminism. And this is the most important thing to me. And I get to share that expertise with audiences like this and with the people who read my book. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, most mornings.
Thank you, Professor Altiri. She's one of the creators of the Legacy Project, has been here with us since day one and brings these issues to our team all the time. So thank you for your contribution. We have maybe time for just a couple more, so a little bit of a lightning round. We're running out of time, but John Carroll had a question. What do you think has been the greatest obstacle for women's suffrage that persists today, that comes from the past, something that is still not achieved yet in that sense?
Well, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is the whole question of women being elected to public office. You know, in the suffrage movement, they were really focused mainly on getting the right to vote. But the logical next step is getting women elected as candidates. And that has turned out to be very difficult. And we know from present experience, and we can actually trace it all the way through, that women just have to work so much harder to be taken seriously as political candidates. And it seems to me that, you know, I'm encouraged by the larger numbers in the Senate, but why isn't it 50-50? It's nowhere near close. I'm encouraged by the leadership that women leaders are around the world, in places like New Zealand and Germany, are showing that women leaders really can make a difference. And yet we know that women are, it's just so easy to hold them to higher standards. We saw it with Hillary Clinton. Kamala Harris is getting it. And there's just a way that women have to always prove themselves. And I wish we were further along with that, because I really do think that this is the next stage. The next step after women getting the vote is having women then take their places at the table in state legislatures, in national organizations, in the cabinet, all across the political spectrum. Because how stupid is it to ignore the contributions of half of the population? And women have an enormous amount to contribute. I just wish it wasn't such an uphill battle.
Kelly asks, do you think social media has helped or hindered social movements as opposed to the in-person rallies and gatherings that you documented in your book?
Well, I try and imagine, you know, my suffragists on Twitter. What I think is that in some ways they were using the technology of their time, the new technology, in creative ways. A good example is they learned that in newsreels that white photographed really well. So they would wear white dresses and the newsreels would then show up much better. My sense is that we have new technology now. It's social media. People are using it. In 100 years from now, there will be something else and people will still be used. I think you use the tools that you have. And yet some of the things are the same. If you think going back to the Women's March, massing in public places, or if you just think about the hard work of how legislation gets passed or how social change happens, that hasn't changed. I mean, some of the smaller techniques, but it's still about lobbying politicians and supporting referendum and getting laws passed. And that is the same no matter what kind of tools you have. I think you just got to use whatever you've got and try and make it as effective as possible.
And our final question, I think it's a good one and a nice one to end with. Before I ask it, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. It really was a powerful presentation, a great book, and we really recommend everyone to pick up a copy of Why They Marched. It was excellent. And maybe just as some final thoughts, Ciara, if I'm pronouncing that right, has asked, if you had a small message to give to young women in the world today, what would it be?
Yes, I asked that. It's Kira, actually. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Yep.
No, okay.
Well, I guess the main thing I would say is welcome to the fight. And that know that there are people like me who have now been a feminist for 50 years, and I'll be a feminist until the day I die. And I am so excited and encouraged to see younger people, younger women joining a sort of a movement that is ever changing. It should be. I mean, my feminism is not going to be your feminism necessarily, but if we see ourselves as part of something larger and embrace that and make it not just about women. It's really about human rights. It's about social justice. And the work, there will always work that needs to be done, and women will be a key part of it. And I am proud to have played a role in that. And I'm also encouraged to know that this will go on after I'm gone. Not planning to go anywhere quite yet. There's still so much to be done.
Well, Susan, again, thank you so much on behalf of CCM and the Legacy Project. We're so thankful for your time and for your scholarship and these wonderful stories and insights. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And Susan, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast.